Chapter 10. A full moon passed and another began, and it was almost summer. Whenever Teo left the little cave to go hunting with Ram, he looked out over the valley to be sure that Vulture Garth or the other hunters were not around. Now he looked across the verdant grasslands, warm and bright in the early morning sunlight, and he saw noisy flocks of dusty brown linnets flying over the meadows, settling at times to rest and feed. Then, rising up again like a tawny cloud, small bands of horses grazed alongside the saga antelopes as they wandered across in the open fields. But this morning Teo saw no man, no hunter. Everything seemed quiet and at peace. Then he saw something far off into the distance. He strained his eyes, but he could not make out, only as long as a line of great brown bodies moving slowly. It came out of the bottomlands along the river, rolling ponderously onto the plains. Teo knew it was a vast herd of animals, but he could not yet see it clearly. Sometimes it was hidden by a white haze of dust that hovered over it, moving along with it. Then it came into view again, a living thing winding its way along. It was still pretty far away, but it was getting closer. Teo held up his hands to his forehead, shielding his eyes from the sun. He looked again. He gasped and he felt his heart leap. "They're here, Ram!" he cried. "The mountains that walk, they've come on back." He picked up his spear and went down to the cliff, stumbling, sliding to the bottom with Ram close behind him. Without stopping, they ran out across the valley, racing through the knee-high grass, scattering the game before them. The antelopes went bounding away. The horses whinnied and galloped off. Breathing heavily, the boy and the wolf dog plunged headlong into the swamps. There they would have to be downwind from the animals. They could hide in the tall reed grass and watch in safety. Standing in the shallow water, they waited silently as the first groups of mammoths lumbered into the open meadow. Teo pushed aside the reeds to get a better view. He could see the herd clearly now. It was made up of cows with many yearlings and calves, as tall as the birch trees. Some of the older elephant-like animals had long sweeping tusks that curved inward, almost crossing over at the end. Thick hanging mats of reddish-brown hair covered their bodies, all shaggy and disheveled from the late spring shedding. The calves wandered on either side of the herd, exploring, romping, and then running on back. Great black-winged vultures soared overhead, circling the herd. Teo counted on his fingers. It had been 3 summers since the mammoths that walked had come through this valley. Now they were back, and Teo was overwhelmed at the sight of them. All of the animals in the valley, he loved to watch the mountains that walked the best. They were like the earth, massive, shaggy old giants lumbering out of the dawn. Moving slowly in scattered groups, the monsters plodded along, pulling up great trunkfuls of grass and bending down the willows and birch trees to get at the succulent buds and twigs. Teo was still downwind from the animal. Never had he seen so many. Never had he been so near to the giant beasts. They were so close he could hear their gurgling rumble of their stomachs. He could smell the musty odor of their bodies and see clouds of black light buzzing around their heads. Ram's eyes followed the slow-moving giants. A low, guttural growl came from deep within his throat. The boy held him tight by the scruff of the neck, and the wolf dog strained until his breathing was almost choked. Teo could feel his Ram's body trembling with excitement. "No, Ram," he whispered. "They're too big. You have no chance against these monsters." The mammoths kept coming and coming, and now they seemed to be everywhere. When Teo heard the sounds behind him, sounds of breaking reeds and sloshing water, sounds of heavy bodies splashing through the swamp, he was no longer downwind. He was no longer safe. They were all around him. Suddenly, one of the lead cows caught the man's scent and sounded the alarm. Long snake-like trunks swept overhead, searching for the danger. Trumpeting shrieks filled the air. Hurriedly, the calves and yearlings moved into the center of the herd. The shrieks and squeals around the thundering bodies were everywhere. Ram tugged and squirmed, and before Teo could stop him, he pulled away and dashed straight into the milling herd. "Stop, Ram! No, stop, no!" Teo shouted, but it was too late. Already the wolf dog was leaping and snapping at the legs of the nearest beast. Teo cried out, shouting again and again, trying to make himself heard, but his voice was drowned out by the pounding feet and wild screams. He stood by helplessly as he saw the wolf dog dart from one angry animal to another, dashing between them and nipping at their legs. With amazing quickness, the big animals whirled around, lashing out, striking back at the annoying pest. 2-3 times, Teo saw Ram disappeared into the jumble of legs and trunks. Any miscue, expecting him to be thrown into the air or impaled on one of those long, curved tusks. Once the wolf dog was caught by a swirling trunk and sent sprawling into the swamp grass. But Ram was quick. He leapt to his feet and charged again, snapping and jumping and dodging out of the way, almost toying with the enraged beast as the boy looked on in horror. Noises filled the swamp. Reeds cracked. The great beasts were crashing through. Teo could feel the earth shake. Wild trumpeting filled his ears, and he heard the slogging footsteps behind him. Slowly he started to back out of the swamp, but the reed grass grew high overhead, and he could not see where the angry monsters were floundering all around him. He could only hear them, sloshing through the water, coming closer and closer as he waited patiently, hoping they would just turn back and go away. But the sound only grew louder. One at a time, he backed away through the tall grass as the plodding beasts came on. With a sinking feeling, he realized that one of the big cows was following him. Teo stood perfectly still, listening to the heavy footsteps and the pounding in his heart. She's there, he thought, and she knows. I'm waiting. Then he saw the reeds bend and crack, and he heard the splash of water as the animal broke through the tall grass. A huge cow loomed up over him, standing like a dark shadow, water dripping from her long reddish-brown hair. Teo's eyes were wide with fright. She was much bigger than expected. Her great shaggy head hung over him. Sharp curving tusks glistened in the sunlight. She lifted her trunk and let out an ear-splitting scream of anger. Teo whirled around. There was no place to run. He stepped back recklessly, trying to force his way through the reeds, and the jagged edges scratched his bare arms. For a long moment the monster towered over him, a low rumbling growl coming deep from in her chest. The boy stumbled backward, falling into the reed. He got up quickly, dripping swamp water from his arms and face. At that moment, the mammoth charged. Dun, dun, dun! With a wild shriek, she lunged at him, stomping, splashing through the water, kicking up showers of slime and mud. Teo dropped his spear. He threw his arms up to protect his face. As the hairy giant came on, a long trunk reached out and gripped around him, around his waist, and it lifted his body up into the air and threw him crashing into the reed grass. With the wind knocked out of him, Teo lay in the murky water trying to catch his breath. He felt stabs of pain. His arms and legs were cut and bleeding. Slowly, he rolled over onto his back. The stagnant water washed around his shoulders. He looked up and saw the tops of the reeds wavering overhead. He started to get up, and then, with the feeling of awesome terror, he saw the great beast standing above him. Her legs were like hairy logs. As she lifted one giant foot and held it over him, then she started to bring it down. Teo rolled out of the way just as the foot splashed in the water beside him. But the angry brute lifted her foot again, and Teo looked up at the cracked, leathery sole about to come down on his head. Just then, with a flash of gray, fur plunged into the reeds. It was Rammy Boy! Ram to the rescue! Ram, flinging himself at the raging mammoth. He badgered her, harassed her, nipped at her legs. She spun around, lashing back at him, but Ram leapt and dodged, staying clear of her swinging trunk. Teo lay still for a moment, his eyes wide open with fear. Slowly he started to get up, his fingers groping for his spear. Just as he got to his feet, the mammoth turned to face him, and with a loud shriek she started to charge. But the great beast never reached him. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the wolf dog chasing her calf, which had come up behind her, and instantly she whirled around and went crashing through the reeds after him. And mud-spattered and tired, Teo stood in the tall reeds waiting and listening, afraid to move. Slowly the sound of thundering herd rumbled off into the distance, and when he was sure he was safe, Teo began washing the dirt and mud from his arms and legs, still bleeding from the cuts and scratches of the sharp reed grass. Painfully, he limped out of the swamp, and in the distance he could see the rising cloud of dust, and he knew the great herd had reformed and continued on its way. With an uneasy feeling, Teo followed the tracks of the wandering beasts, hoping he would not find Ram trampled in the dust. He had not gone far when he saw the wolf dog loping towards him through the meadow, his sides heaving, his tongue hanging out. He was wet, his gray coat caked with mud. Teo threw his arms around the animal's neck, burying his face in his wet fur. "You're so brave, Ram," he said, "but you're also a fool. The mammoths are not rabbits. They're dangerous." Ram's eyes were bright, and he was panting heavily from his wild run. "This time I was lucky," said Teo. "You saved my life. Never again will I let you chase the mountains that walk."